about 1/10 of the world's population will be celebrating. Over 500 million people are registered Buddhists. And Visak is a Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit term for the lunar month, corresponding to April, May, but is also one of the names given to the holiest day of the year for Buddhists. It's also sometimes called Buddha Purnima. Purnima means full moon day, or Buddha Jayanti, which means victorious. You probably know that. And as the almanac indicates, it's celebrated as not just the birthday, but also the day of enlightenment and the death day of the historical Buddha. Now, there are many deep mysteries regarding the nature of the historical Buddha. And in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, they assert that the being who took birth about 500 years before Christ and is known to us as Shakyamuni Buddha, because he belonged to the Shakya tribe, that this being was actually enlightened in a previous world period, long before our own, and only took birth in our period in order to reenact the path and show others the way to enlightenment. But skipping over many mysteries and complexities, such as this, for our purposes today, we could divide the life of the Buddha, which was about an 80-year incarnation, into three main parts. The first being his birth, childhood, and early adulthood. The second being a 6-year-long period in, which describes his life and search as a forest dweller, or sannyasam, that leads to his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. And the third phase pertains to the 44 years of public life he lived, during which he elaborated one of the most extraordinary and revolutionary oral teachings that is known to humanity. And it's a teaching, as you know, which has come to be known as the religion of Buddhism, but which in its written form, in the Tibetan tradition, constitutes the equivalent of over 30 or 40 Bibles. So to tell the whole story would take weeks, but fortunately for you all, Renée has asked me to speak only about this first phase of the Buddha's life. So the man famously known to history as Shakyamuni Buddha was born as, his given name was Siddhartha Gautama. And he was a handsome, gifted son of King Shuddhodana, who ruled Kapila Vastu, which was a small but very prosperous kingdom near what is today southern Nepal. And according to traditional accounts of his birth, it was preceded by a strange dream that his mother had, in which a snowy white elephant with 6 tusks came and, which is long revered as a kind of symbol of divine wisdom, came and pressed a lotus against her side. And in her dream, that lotus became the embryo of the Buddha. And in addition, the court astrologers of the king all predicted that a remarkable child would soon be born, but they couldn't agree whether he would be a great king, great conqueror, or a great spiritual teacher. And his father, the king, preferred that Siddhartha would assume the throne. And therefore, he not only took great care to educate and discipline his son with the best and most rigorous, the best known teachers in all the arts and sciences, and the arts of warfare, and of astronomy, of mathematics, and so on, but also took great care to shield him from any of the unsettling facts of human life that might turn his attention towards a spiritual quest. For example, even though there was no pandemic at the time, it is said that he was not allowed to venture outside the luxurious palace grounds that had been specially built for him. And only people who were healthy, joyful, and energetic were allowed to teach or entertain or to interact with him. No mention was allowed to be made of death or old age, of sorrow, of pain or sickness. And even the withered flower buds and fallen leaves of trees, it said, were plucked and swept away before the prince could see them. And around the time of his 16th birthday, the king had his ministers create a great festival, which involved games and competitions of various sorts, and in which the fairest and most beautiful, eligible maidens of the land were to be brought to the palace in order to receive prizes from the hands of the prince. But after a very long line of lovely young women whom Siddhartha seemed utterly uninterested in, the fairest and most beautiful, most elegant and graceful of them all, the young Yasodhara, came last. And it said that at this point, the prince had handed out all the gifts, so there was no more prizes to be given. And so he took a jeweled necklace that he was wearing and placed it around the waist of Yasodhara. And that when their eyes met, love immediately blossomed. And they were soon married and had a child. And the king and his ministers thought for sure would keep the prince from fleeing to the forest in search of spiritual knowledge. But even the warm embrace of such a wealthy and honored life, of riches, education, and of sport, of love and of family comforts, despite all of this, Siddhartha would often have dreams of his larger duty to humanity, and which called to him and haunted him during the night. And such was his longing to see the lands and the peoples outside the palace walls that eventually the king could no longer deny him. He, this is the year of his 29th birthday, he allowed Channa, his chariot driver, to take Siddhartha out beyond the palace gates. But before he did so, he gave orders throughout the city and in surrounding towns that none who were sick or old or maimed should be seen by the prince, that everything should be cleaned and washed and the streets swept and the houses painted and brightened up and freshly cut flowers, and so that nothing sorrowful or suffering should be evident. And as the chariot emerged from behind the palace walls, he was indeed met with joyous chants of victory, with music, with song, with none but smiling faces, happy to see their future king. And thus the prince was nearly convinced that life was quite as happy and pleasant as it had been within the palace. But as fate would have it, near the end of his excursion, an old beggar who did not heed the king's request appeared. And as the chariot of the prince approached, the beggar slowly arose from his shadowed hovel and stretched out his wrinkled, gnarled hand, demanding alms, but choking and coughing and blinking and groaning with withering spasms. And the townspeople tried to quickly whisk him away to hide him, but the prince saw it and cried, "Let be, let be. Channa, what thing is this? Who seems a man, yet so miserable, so horrible, so sad?" And Channa replied, "Why, this is but an old man, too weak and aged to be of use. But do not trouble yourself, Prince. No need to worry or bother, because his spark will soon go out." Siddhartha was, astonished and taken aback, and he continued to inquire. He said, "But is this a rare event, or do others suffer and end in this way?" And Channa explained, "To be sure, everyone who reaches this age ends their days in this way, wrinkled, worn, and feeble as he is." Now, we know Renée is an exception to the rule, but
Being as old as I am.
But so vivacious. The prince was not done with his questioning. He said, but wait, you mean if I live this long, I will be thus? And Yasodhara? And all my friends and cousins and even my young son? Yes, great sir, came the reply. And again, utterly aghast, the prince was stunned and said, turn back, Chana, return to the palace. I have seen that which I did not think I would see. And throughout the days and weeks that followed, it said that the prince's heart was darkened by this fact that all that he loved so and cherished would in time be ravaged in the same way. And even seeing Yasodhara and the beauty of his young son and his friends could not break the spell of sadness, knowing that they too would eventually meet a similar end. And again, throughout the night, his sleep was rocked and shaken by fearful, thunderous dreams in which he imagined these truths being evident for all of humanity, but somehow being ignored by them. And the dreams shattered further his sense of peace and contentment with the life he was living. But along with the dreams also came visions of his destined future, that he would someday help to rescue those who suffer in this way. And despite the best efforts of the king to distract him with princely duties, with sport, with music, and all sorts of delights, the spirit of the prince compelled him to plead again to venture outside the palace walls. And eventually the king consented but again ordered all who were sick or maimed or elderly should be kept indoors, and all, again, the streets made clean, the houses washed, all be made bright and well ordered. But on the second journey, as fate would have it, a sick man lying in the tall grass near the roadside painfully, mournfully tried to rise to his feet and then collapsed again just as the chariot passed. And the prince, seeing him, leapt from the chariot car and rushed to his side, asking Chana what had befallen the poor man. And Chana said, "Great prince, this man is smitten by some plague. In his veins, the blood which once was wholesome now leaps and boils. His heart beats like an ill-played drum. His strength has fled, and all the grace and joy of manhood is gone. This is a sick man with the fit upon him, and you should not be holding him, as it may pass to you." But the prince refused to stop comforting the man and said, again, "Is this something rare, or are there many who suffer in this way?" And Chana replied, "Why, yes, sickness such as this comes in many forms, like the sly snake that strikes unseen." Again, the prince was taken back and said, "But if they do not grow old, as the beggar whom I last saw, and they cannot bear the pains in the way that this man is, what then becomes of persons? What happens to them then?" And Chana replied, "Well, of course they die. All must eventually die. This is the common destiny," he said, "of all flesh, high or low, good or bad. Behold," said Chana, "where comes a dead man now?" And sure enough, not far away, a band of wailing townspeople crying to their gods to ease their sorrow, carried the corpse of a loved one to be burned at the funeral pyre. This is the tradition, long been the tradition in India. And as Siddhartha and Chana watched, the pyre was lit and burned over the course of many hours until little remained but ashes, scarlet and gray, with here and there a bone picked at by crows and worms. And deeply touched, the prince responded, and I'm going to read now from a short passage from The Light of Asia, which is by Sir Edwin Arnold, and many of the details that I've just shared with you come from his rendition of the Buddha's life. And this is how he describes Siddhartha's response. Siddhartha turned, eyes gleaming with divine tears, to the sky, eyes lit with heavenly pity to the earth. From sky to earth he looked, from earth to sky, as if his spirit sought in lonely flight some far-off vision, linking this and that, lost, past, but searchable, but seen, but known. Then cried he, while his lifted countenance glowed with the burning passion of a love unspeakable, the ardor of a hope boundless, insatiate. O suffering world, O known and unknown of my common flesh, caught in this common net of death and woe, and life which binds to both, I see, I feel the vastness of the agony of earth, the vainness of its joys, the mockery of all its best, the anguish of its worst. Since pleasures end in pain, and youth in age, and love in loss, and life in hateful death, and death in unknown lives, which will but yoke men to the wheel again to whirl the round of false delights and woes that are not false. And I'm just going to pause here for a second, because at this time, as you find in India today, many people assume the truth of reincarnation, that people are not just born one time, but many times. And so the prince is imagining that this is not, that this life which ends in suffering is happening again and again for many vast numbers of people. Me too, this lure hath cheated, so it seemed lovely to live, and life a sunlit stream, forever flowing in a changeless peace, whereas the foolish ripple of the flood dances so lightly down by bloom and lawn, only to pour its crystal quicklier into the foul salt sea. So again, he's reflecting on how pleasure ends in pain. The veil is rent, which blinded me. So he was blinded, but now the drapes have opened. I am as all these men who cry upon their gods and are not heard or are not heeded. Yet there must be aid. For them and me and all, there must be help. Perchance the gods have need of help themselves, being so feeble when sad lips cry they cannot save. I would not let one cry whom I could save. And it's this, boundless pity and compassion for the plight of humanity, which, and these events, which we just tried to describe very briefly, which compelled the prince to eventually, in the days and weeks that followed, to decide to renounce his kingdom, give up the future throne and kingship, to leave the love and comforts of his family, and to go in search of the greatest spiritual teachers of his day, to become a forest dweller, what's called a sannyasin, and to dedicate the remainder of his life to finding what's called a final stainless answer, if answer could be found, to end all suffering.
So what did he do?
Wait a minute, you asked me just to tell the first part.
That's stage two, Renée. That's stage two. That's a whole other time.
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful and long story too, which there are many different accounts. You have to understand that there's many different schools of Buddhism, and the story of the Buddha's life is been rendered in many different ways. But essentially, he went to, as I mentioned, in search of the greatest spiritual teachers of his day that were known in India at the time, and learned, because of his earnest desire to know, learned everything that he could from each teacher. But as he, and that typically would involve training in the virtues and in meditation particularly. That was one of the great focuses of forest dwelling life, right, is to train the mind and heart in deep states of meditation. And that's why one sought these quiet and withdrawn places, so that one would have the peace and time to do that. But it's also said that as he, with each teacher that he studied under, that he found that there was some limitation, which he would master the teaching of that teacher, but at some point find that it didn't bring him the answer he was searching for. And he finally ended up with a group of 5 ascetics who were living as a group in the forest and practicing some of the most strenuous forms of asceticism, of fasting, eating very little, living off roots and plants, never pursuing or allowing contact with village people at all, and just this very rigorous form of asceticism. But he also found that on one particular occasion, this is a very famous story that's told, that he was becoming increasingly weak and weary, and that his capacity to sustain these long periods of meditation were being affected by his physical weakness. And he had a dream, the god Indra, it is said, came to him playing a 3-stringed lute. And the instruction that he gained from that dream was that the string, if it's tightened too rigorously, it doesn't give the harmonious sound, right? And in fact, if you strike it too hard and it's strung too hard, it'll break. But if it's tuned and if it's too lax, then it also will not give the harmonious sound, right? So it has to be, each string has to be precisely tuned, just right. And it's this that it is said, was part of what formed his eventual articulation of what's called the middle way, that a too rigorous form of asceticism is not going to get you there. And obviously overindulgence is not going to get you there either. So one has to find a moderate path. And in this search for a kind of a more moderate path, he took some rice from a passing maiden who offered him a bowl of rice, and he ate from it. And because of that, he was utterly rejected by the 5 other ascetics, as he had broken the rules, of their group and of their aspirations. And but he found that the nourishment that he gained from that rice revived him. It reawakened his energies and his mind. And because of it, he felt that now he could indeed kind of pierce those final veils that he had been searching for inwardly through meditation. And he resolved to sit under, at a certain point, again, nourished, to sit under the Bodhi tree, which now is the famous tree under which the Buddha gained enlightenment, and to not move from that spot until he found that answer he was searching for. And then there's we could spend another period just talking about the stages that he went through in the night of enlightenment, because it was a series, it was a whole epic, an epic series, in which he gained various forms of insight and vision regarding the nature of life, the nature of human evolution, what brings about human incarnation, human suffering, and where the answer lies. And but not only that, but how the cosmos came to be, how the cosmos came to birth, and what was the process. So it was like seeing through cycle upon cycle to the roots of things, not just human life, but cosmic life as well. And that in the final stage, Mara, who is like the personification of all the temptations and wiles and desires and you could say ignorance and other you could say shackles that binds the mind, appeared, and it's and attacked him in their fiercest form. And this is like one of the final stages of this night of enlightenment, just before dawn, where all the forces opposing enlightenment came upon him, and he conquered them all simply by touching the earth. And this is one of the famous statues that you'll see of the Buddha in meditation, where he has one hand down and he's touching the earth, because he's calling the earth to witness the fact that none of these forces can present a problem to the awakened mind, to the mind that is settled in the truth of things, in the essence of things. And it was in that discovery of that which transcends all the changes, that transcends all the forces that we know of, inward and outward, which provides a kind of refuge that is possible for any human being to reach. And this is what we, have come to know as the teaching of nirvana, the doctrine of nirvana, that there is that once all the causes that lead to suffering are discovered and known and understood, that those causes can be undone, and that in undoing them, one also, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, that's the process, which is the title of in the almanac, your almanac this week, the Noble Eightfold Path, that is the path which leads to this condition in which suffering ends for humanity. But just one other very important fact about this, and this is what you find as a primary distinction between what's called Southern Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism and Northern Buddhism, or Mahayana and the Tibetan tradition, is that the highest form of nirvana is actually that it's a non-dual wisdom in which there is no separation between the mind of enlightenment and the mind that involves itself in the world. That is, that an awakened one, such as the Buddha achieved, can participate, can teach, can involve himself in human life, can be incarnated in human life, can aid others ceaselessly. That this is what real nirvana allows the Buddhas of compassion to do, is to ceaselessly aid humanity while also maintaining that awareness in consciousness of being that which transcends all the changes, which is at utter peace and rooted in the truth and essence of things. I didn't know I was going to have to tell that part, so I didn't really prepare for it. But
oh, magnificent, magnificent! Thank you so much.
And then the Buddha also exemplified that throughout his life, because the final 44 years of his life, that is exactly what he did. He taught. And I'll just mention one thing. When I first began to learn about Buddhism, there was a small book called The Footprints of the Buddha by a woman named Marie Biles. And if you're new to Buddhism and you want to understand something about the life of the Buddha and what it might have been like to be present when he was living, because thousands of people visited him in the forest, whether they were monks or not, and he met with kings and princes and traveled widely, so that many could hear his teaching. And what Biles does is she tells the story as though she is one of those people who go to visit and listen to the Buddha. And it's very moving and very touching and very evocative. It like puts you in that place. And this is one of the other things that's said about trying to understand the Buddha is you have to some degree, enter into the light of the Buddha, which is a transcendent light, right? It's a very peaceful light, and it's a compassionate light. So it combines both wisdom and compassion, a sense of wanting to help the plight of others and to live in a way that is an aid to others, a true aid, at the same time cultivating that sense of peace and centeredness that I know is very much a part of what the center is about.
Yeah, too.
Anyway, so I'd highly recommend her book if you wanted to get an introduction to the life of the Buddha.
Footprints of the Buddha.
Footprints of, yes.
Yeah.
And it's very inexpensive, $3 or $4. You can get a paperback copy.
I have a question. The three jewels that you referred to, taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, how could we understand taking refuge in the Buddha?
Well, that's
given all the meanings we tend to put, but taking refuge in the Buddha.
yes. Thank you, Jim.
And can I add to it?
Yes.
We're going to have a presentation next week on Mother Mary. So will you consider that? We're studying gems from all the world's wisdom traditions.
You want me to consider it?
Yes, in your answer.
In my response?
Yep. And then other people too.
Okay. Well, I know this is something that Jim has thought a lot about. So if I leave anything out, Jim, I hope you'll feel free, or Renee or Cliff, because I know that you've all thought about this idea a lot. But it's an excellent question. In fact, we were just thinking about it recently, because when you think of refuge, you think of, a resting place. That this is a place where I can be protected. I can withdraw from the world. I will not be affected by all the woes and sorrows and pain and so on, the uncertainty. But in this tradition, this is a core part of this tradition, because in fact, to even take the beginning to dedicate oneself to the path of Buddhism, this is you could say commitment that one makes, that I take refuge in the Buddha, the teacher. I take refuge in the Dharma, which is the teaching, and I take refuge in the Sangha, which is the group of seekers, wherever they happen to be. And you can, to Renee's point, you can apply this to any tradition. It's relevant to any tradition, because you could think of, for example, the teaching of Christ, how important the teaching and the words of Jesus are That would be the Dharma of the Christian tradition. You could think of how important the example of Jesus is. That would be in that tradition, that would be the Buddha. And how important the community of seekers is, those who are authentically engaged in and trying to live the life that Jesus pointed to. My understanding, I'll just say a few words about what the idea of refuge means. It is, in a sense, and at least in one of its aspects, it would be that as opposed to placing my dependence, my sense of importance, my values on things of the world, on wealth, for example, on possessions, on only on family, only on having a great job, having a nice house, and all those things that all of us are caught up in. That rather than placing my utmost importance on those things, it's a commitment to the internal, what's internal, because the nature of the Buddha, you can say, again, this can apply to many different teachers and different traditions. To understand the nature of the Buddha and commit yourself to it, it's a lifelong process. It's not something that you do once on one day and say, oh, now I've got it, right? It's a lifelong commitment. And same with the Dharma. The more you learn about the teaching, the deeper it becomes, the more it affects all aspects of your life, of your thinking, of every action that you engage in. Every activity can be, you could say, permeated by, can be affected by, can be altered, and should be altered by that fundamental commitment to the spiritual life, to the and again, it's as we tried to mention, in the case of the Mahayana Buddhists, it's not a spiritual quest in which one is seeking something for oneself, but one is seeking it on behalf of others. And it's a core teaching in the Northern Buddhist tradition called bodhicitta, that the seed of enlightenment, the seed that's going to eventually flower into a true form of enlightenment, is that which seeks on behalf of others. And that in fact needs to be, that's the true refuge, the place of refuge, is that which is committing itself to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha on behalf of the whole.
Thank you.
I'd love to hear other comments on that question.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I found your comment about the core having to do with commitment. Rings very true in terms of what one understands about the Buddhist teaching and about spirituality in general. And it's interesting the way you've been phrasing it, because to see the Buddha as a seeker initially, as someone on an earnest quest, is the seed of becoming a Buddha. So to take refuge in the Buddha, to see him as a being who was a seeker and a searcher unconditionally, and then to recognize that the only way then to begin to understand what he discovered is to study the Dharma. And then if you practice it in human relationships, you begin to understand the vitality of the teachings, and it begins, as you say, to transform the character of the person that's doing it. And so what begins as understanding him as a seeker and a questioner, and you begin to emulate that, in time becomes full of insight as to what the teachings really are about. So I thought that was very, very helpful, a very interesting way of phrasing it.
Mary, I'm interested what you might have to say at this point. I saw you kind of nodding your head when I think he was talking about the how it affects the whole of our lives to really commit ourselves to a teacher and a teaching. Leaves nothing untouched.
I am not knowledgeable about Buddha or Buddhism or any of that. I see a lot of parallels with my teaching in Catholicism, and we're here to live a good life and to help others. That's what I have always been taught. And so I see a lot of parallels. I see some paradoxes, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to hear other options or hear more about others and what they believe, how they lived, what they were taught. Because we're all in a journey. We're all at different points in that journey, and it's all good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kirk, I had a question. At the beginning of your presentation, you divided the life of the Buddha into 3 stages.
Mhm.
And as you were talking about the first stage, I was thinking that maybe even the life of the historical Jesus could be divided into 3 stages as well, because there's a whole period when he's missing in action, like for 20 years, like from the age of 12 all the way up to the age of 30. Could that be his forest time a little bit, possibly? Is there a parallel there? Or Mary, what do you think?
I honestly don't think he went anywhere. He was always with his mother and with Joseph, his foster father. I have never heard anything about him going into the desert until he started his public life. So I believe that he just took care of his mother until it was time for him to go and preach. And he did wait until his first adventure was to go into the desert for the 40 days. And when he came back is when he started his public life. So there were a number of times during his public life where he tried to get away, but everybody was constantly following him. And he only had 3 years of a public life. So he did try, and people wanted to know more, and they didn't want to let him go. And that's all that I am aware of. And so if he went any place during those 20 years that he was not, we don't have anything about. I know there are people that have speculated, but I honestly don't know what the speculations have been. But from what I know and from what I feel, he didn't have that in the disappearing into the forest or self introspection type of thing. Sorry.
No, that's okay. What about the 40 days? Does that at all have parallels to what Kirk was describing during that
Well,
Buddha?
it was he went into the desert to understand what he was supposed to do, to get more direction from his father, and to understand what his mission was, what he was called to do. So it's an interesting thing. I don't know how many of us could do that now. I think we have to come to a point in our lives or a crisis, and we have to shut everything out. And then we go inside, and then we try to regroup ourselves.
There is, I know there are people who have done comparisons between the Buddha's life and Christ's life, Jesus's life. And there are actually many parallels. for example, the three temptations that Christ endured are very similar to the three most compelling temptations that the Buddha had to conquer in his final night of enlightenment. I think there are many mysteries about the life of Jesus that may never be known entirely. But I have heard suggestions that that period of his life in which very little is known, that he did visit other teachers, and that he was part of you could say a hidden. It was a period of instruction and of awakening for him, a very critical one. But very little is known about it that I'm aware of.
My understanding is that one of the worst temptations for the Buddha was the thought that he could have done all this great suffering to try to, on his own behalf, to find the path out of suffering for the rest of the humanity. And that having done all that, it would be worthless, meaningless. So what?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which I imagine strikes all of us at different points in time when we feel as if we've just made such tremendous efforts, and then we have this little niggling thought, yeah, but so what? What good does all that I've done? What good is it going to be?
Yes. Well, that's one of the other stories that is also told about the Buddha, is that this faculty of understanding and a vision that he had allowed him to, and this is said about other great teachers as well, it's not only the Buddha, that he could, in his mind's eye, see who amongst the current population that he would encounter would be receptive, and who would not. The analogy that's often told is that there's those is the analogy of a lotus, right? There's the lotus that's still stuck in the bottom of the pond in the mud, and the light is can't even hardly reach that level because it's dark and murky down there, and time will need to pass, maybe another incarnation, another life, that person, that bud will eventually make its way up through the water. And there are those who are partway up in the water and who will benefit by the light that's coming down and striking the top of the pond. They may not reach and flower in that life, but they will benefit, they will grow, they will prosper by being exposed to it. And then there are others who just need that extra sunshine in order to open up and flower and like a lotus does on the top of the pond, to rise above the waters of the pond and open themselves up to the light. And that he could see where people were at and know who would benefit and who would not. So anyway, it's a wonderful story in my mind.
One of my favorite stories, actually, it's a very simple story, but it could be in response to that temptation of the futility of, gaining enlightenment but not being able to help anyone else, is the starfish story, which probably some of you have heard, but I just love it so much. It's one of my favorite stories. I'll just share it real briefly about a mother and her daughter who are walking along the shoreline, and there's all these starfish that have washed up on the shore. So the daughter breaks free from her mother and starts running around and picking up starfish and putting them back, throwing them back in the ocean so they'll live. And the mother comes up to the daughter and says, dear girl, look, there are thousands and thousands of starfish on the shore. You can never help all of these starfish. Like, it's a futile exercise. And the little girl looks to her mama and says, but what about this one? It'll matter to this one. And I just love that innocent, enthusiastic answer. And in last week's Gems of the Wisdom, the lady was talking about having this vision with this, she had this like little tiny cedar tree, was it? Or
Oh, a couple weeks ago.
couple weeks.
Yeah. Me too.
She had this little tree in her house. They were
No, she was dancing
around it.
Yeah.
But she had this vision of seeing all trees in this one tree. And that's true of humanity, that all of humanity is represented in every human being.
Mm.
So in helping one, in some small sense, you're really helping all. It's a beautiful idea. I love the starfish story.
Yeah, that's a good one, Cliff. Thank you. I don't think I've heard it, actually. It's
It's
probably more common in Hawaii than in California.
Well, there's more starfish, I think, in California.
Are there? Yeah, okay.
I don't know.
It's like the Dalai Lama when he was asked, well, how are you going to convert the communist Chinese? And he said, one communist Chinese at a time. So, yeah.
Noah, did you have any thoughts come to mind?
So many.
I know.
But actually, on the topic of taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, I spent a lot of time recently talking to a friend of mine who's going through a job search. He hasn't lost his job because of COVID, but he's just at a place to sort of take his career to the next stage. And he's experiencing what he calls, because he's a psychologist, imposter syndrome. And I was thinking about, these anxieties that I think a lot of us deal with. And the idea of taking refuge as a sort of a balm for that, a sort of like, you don't have to be enlightened right now. Like, let the Buddha, let the Dharma, let the Sangha carry you, or cover you or protect you. To me, that's sort of how I would interpret the taking refuge. And I think I've heard other people talk about it, at various retreats and Buddhist things that I've been at over the years. Yeah, so just sort of thinking of it that way from a very practical, like, dealing with the day-to-day anxieties.
Yeah.
I loved your description, Kirk. I thought that was just amazing. I've heard, obviously, the story many times, and you just did a beautiful job in such a short period of time. Thank you. That was really special, really, really special. And I had a lot of thoughts too. And I feel like beginner's heart mind, all of a sudden. It's like my mind can't think of anything. But for me, taking refuge in the Buddha means not the Buddha outside, or not even a concept. It's just resting in my core, resting in my who I am. And because we are all one, whether it seems like we're changing or helping anyone outside, just by our inward love and compassion in our everyday life toward our dishes, toward anything that we handle, because they're sentient beings, we also are saving all sentient beings. And I think that there's, for me, my understanding of enlightenment is we all already are enlightened, and we're going to live enlightenment. And it's like, it's not something that we attain, it's something we are. And it's the same with the Buddha. We are the Buddha. And I was Catholic too, Mary. And when I started Buddhism many years ago, and I Zen Catholicism and many books, and the Christ within. And for a long time, I said Christ within because I didn't even want to say Buddha nature, because it just 50 years ago, you didn't talk about that because that was idol worshiping or something like that. But there's something about owning that sense of love and compassion toward ourselves and others, that as we do that, especially in this time of our life with all that's going on, keeping that faith and that resting in that oneness, in the divine wisdom, and in the dharma of understanding that life is suffering and the way out is the Eightfold Path, and just living. The reason we suffer is because we want it to be different. And so it's like really living in that. For me, it means really living in my core, in my truth of living enlightenment in this only moment. And that it's not about the Buddha outside, but it's about the Buddha nature inside, or my core self inside that connects with all that is. And that, so whatever I do for everybody and everyone. And it doesn't make me bigger or stronger. It's just that we're all connected. We are all one. And so as you said, that whether you're on the top of the lotus or in the muck, we're all in the muck in some way, it's like. So I really appreciate the comments, and it gave me a lot to think about and have a lot more to think about. So thank you very much.
That was beautifully said. Thank you.
Yeah, it really was beautifully said, and I think it's a beautiful summary for what we've done. I think the only couple people we haven't heard from are Sharon and David. If either of you want to say something before we close.
Yeah. I heard that similar story by Herman Hesse in the book called, Siddhartha. And the ending of it, because he went past from what you did, and his last journey was crossing a river with a ferry boat man. And the man was so happy. He lived in a little hut by the river, and he was very happy. So after he encountered or did all the experiences that Kirk mentioned, he came back and he sat under the Bodhi tree and he looked at the river, and he didn't understand why was the ferryman living in his little hut so happy, and what was causing him to do that. And so he went back and asked the ferryman, and he said the answer is in that river that's flowing in front of you.
Thank you.
That is a beautiful book. I adore that story. It is different than the traditional Buddhist story, but it's a wonderful book. I can highly recommend it.
David.
There were three things that struck me. The notion of touching the earth, because I think I ran across something from Mark Nepo in a class I took this morning along that line. But it reminded me of this notion that the simple touching of the earth brings us into the now. And all the illusion is thoughts of the past, thoughts of the future, things that are not here and now. And it kind of brought me to Eckhart Tolle's notion of the power of now. That simple grounding down, right here, right now, dissolves all of the illusion. So that's something for me to kind of delve into further. And this notion, I think it was Matsuo Basho, seeking refuge. Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise. Seek what they sought. And that's what came to me when I first heard that quote. It reminds me of what you were saying there about seeking refuge. Is we're not trying to follow the Buddha. We're seeking what the Buddha sought, which led me to the quote from Jesus that on his talk about doing miracles is that even greater things shall ye do, because we're all seeking that same. We're all seeking what he sought. That's what came to me.
Very fine comments. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all. Wonderful meeting.
Thank you, Kirk. That was a wonderful telling of the
Wonderful.
story
Thank
of
you.
Buddha.
Yes.
Thank you for putting this together, Renee. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Renee.